Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and it's Tuesday, so we are doing our weekly meta tier list for Pokemon TCG Pocket. This is week 3 of the Celestial Guardians format. Of course, yesterday we did our Meta Monday, following the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time, where a lot has changed, realistically, on how the meta is shaped. In this video, in this tier list, we've got 25 of the most relevant decks, I would say, in the metagame right now. And yeah, I would say that the decks that we have this week are kind of a lot different than the decks that we've had in previous weeks. Some decks just really haven't seen any play, and then some new decks have actually done really well. So again, we've kind of shifted around the decks that are on the tier list. If anything is not on the tier list this week that you think maybe should be, comment down below and let me know. If it's not something that's really seen success or seen play over the last week, it just doesn't really make the tier list, and that's kind of how it goes. I can't spend all day talking about 50 different decks, especially when some of them just aren't really seeing any play. So let's just dive right into it, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, I really appreciate all of the support. But again, a lot of you guys that watch my videos every week are not subscribed. So if that is one of you, I would highly recommend that you hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Let's dive right into it. So we're going to start off with Infernape. Now, again, one thing I will say is that we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about the decks because we've already probably talked about them in previous videos, but I do want to go ahead and talk about their position in the metagame and kind of what kind of a choice I believe that they're, justify in the format right now. That's what the tier list is all about. Not so much like in a vacuum how strong the decks are, but really how they are in the current format right now, which is changing around a ton, again, as we've seen in yesterday's video. But anyway, leading off with Infernape. Infernape is an interesting one. It hasn't been on the tier list in previous weeks, but it did make top cut at the largest tournament ever this weekend, and it also had a couple of appearances where it just kind of did really good. Now, I just have Infernape as a card here on the tier list because there are a couple of ways that people are playing it. I've seen it most success paired with Infernape EX or just playing it with Turtonator, similar to how we're playing Turtonator with Charizard or Infernape or Incineroar. So Infernape is a really strong Pokemon, and it does kind of fit fairly well in the metagame currently right now, especially considering that Meowscarada is seeing so much play that Infernape really should be able to take a KO as long as they don't have Leaf Cape. But Infernape for 2 energies does do 140. That's 160 to, of course, any grass Pokemon, and Meowscarada is certainly going to see a ton of play. That's really what might be kind of the most interesting point of contention for this video, are the grass decks and Meowscarada and Decidueye, because that deck certainly did the best out of any of the decks of the last format, and I know a lot of people are kind of curious where that's going to go on the tier list, and I do put timestamps so people can skip ahead, but Infernape is an interesting one. I don't necessarily think that it's like that great of a fire deck. I think there's a lot of better options, but of course, given the landscape of the metagame of this past weekend's tournament, I'm not surprised that a variety of different fire decks did make it into day 2. Infernape certainly was one of those decks. There was a couple of Charizard and Incineroar decks, and there was also a few Turtonator decks that also made top cut as well. So again, no real surprise to see Infernape, kind of make it into that 128 top bracket, even though it necessarily may not be the most popular choice or the best choice as far as fire decks go. One thing I will say though is that Infernape is a little bit underwhelming, but also really good in some scenarios. 2 energies to attack is certainly good, but you discard those energies, so we don't have a really great way to attack turn after turn with Infernape. However, I will say that after a Turtonator combination, we should have enough to really KO most things that we're going up against, and that certainly is really relevant for Infernape. Similar to things like Incineroar or Charizard, it doesn't need a ton of energies to attack. Like, you got to think about it like this. If you're committing your energies to Turtonator before you, go into the Infernape afterwards, you have to still attach 2 energies to Infernape to attack. That is, of course, if you've just been attaching to Turtonator at the beginning of the game. Incineroar can attack for 1 energy, but Charizard can also technically attack for 1 energy. You just stoke. So you're going to be waiting at least 2 turns to attack with either Charizard or Infernape. Charizard does 150, but Infernape does 140. Incineroar does 140, but again, you need 3 energies onto it. So I think Infernape is actually a pretty good partner for Turtonator, but I just don't know if it's necessarily as good of a Pokemon as things like Incineroar or Charizard, like in a vacuum. However, again, heavy grass-dominated format at least this past weekend, and I do expect grass to see a lot of play in the upcoming weeks just because it really is such a well-positioned deck, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and just put all of the Infernape variants, whether it's with Turtonator or it's with like Incineroar. However you're playing Infernape, I think it's certainly like a B-tier choice in the format right now. I think you're going to struggle against certain things. I do think that if you pair it with Turtonator, you at least have the opportunity to be able to take down those Oricorio decks, because otherwise you really just aren't necessarily able to do that. You can attack with Monferno if you are playing it, but that's just not necessarily something that I would recommend going for. So again, you're going to struggle. Incineroar, if you're pairing it with Infernape, can just do the burn damage to Oricorio, but they typically play Shaman and things like that. So yeah, anyway, I say B tier is probably a safe choice for Infernape. There are other fire decks that might be higher up on the tier list, but for now, Infernape, I think, is probably just going to sit right there into the B tier. Next up, we've got Banette, and Banette with Greninja is actually kind of what people are playing right now. Now, Banette and Greninja didn't actually see any representation in Top Cut of this last weekend's tournament, but it was actually fairly successful, and it was actually a fairly played amount deck. And it kind of feels to me that Banette is a really interesting Pokemon. I've talked about it in a variety of different weeks. It always kind of finds its way into the metagame. Certainly one of those fringe decks that isn't seeing a ton of play, but is something that still sees play and actually always has a pretty consistent win rate. It's one of those fringe meta decks where people don't really look at it as a contender, but it always does well enough to kind of justify talking about it week after week. So this week, I do think that a lot of people have been playing it with Greninja, with Tapu Lele, maybe also with the Oricorio, the psychic one that does 80 damage like Marshadow. And I think that it's totally fine. Now, I do have on the tier list sort of a Tapu Lele Oricorio variant. And this variant here is basically like Aggro Psychic. There's a lot of decks that play that really sort of aggro, fast-paced Tapu Lele Oricorio combination, whether it's with Gengar, whether it's with Mimikyu, whether it's with Banette. This Banette deck is a little bit different. It's, I think, kind of what people have settled on in terms of playing Banette, and that is going to be with Greninja. I think it's really smart. Greninja can attack a bench Pokemon. You can bring it up with Cyrus, and then you can lock it in with Banette's attack. And I think it's a really decent strategy, a strategy that I actually really quite like, and especially when you pair it with Tapu Lele. It's all a bunch of non-EX Pokemon, so it kind of flows somewhat well. It's a little bit awkward, but it is certainly still a strong deck. I also feel pretty good about Banette. Like, I don't know what else really to say about Banette other than that. Like, I actually always feel like it's pretty decent. Like, I really do kind of respect the people that play Banette. And I think it always kind of does well, like from a win rate perspective. Now, again, it's sort of off meta, it's sort of fringe meta, but it did have like a 50% win rate this week against a lot of meta decks, and it did see play more than some of the other decks that are on this tier list. So I am actually also going to put Banette in the B tier. Again, it's hard for me to really rank decks that don't see a ton of play, but consistently do see a little bit of play and do well. That's kind of where the B tier really does fall in for me. It's hard to justify putting decks in the A tier unless they're either seeing a lot of play, a decent amount of success, or decent representation in Top Cut. Banette and Greninja did do well. Like, Banette did do well at this tournament. It just didn't make any, none of the players playing it made Top Cut, but a lot of the players were just below that threshold, and it's consistent week after week. So I kind of have to put it in the B tier. I really do like Banette. I honestly do. I keep saying I like it, but I do. I think it deserves to see more play, but for whatever the reason, of course, it's not something that's really caught on. In terms of its positioning, I think it's kind of dependent or independent, towards whatever's kind of seeing play. It really doesn't matter that much, what the metagame looks like for Banette, because it is sort of like a trump card type deck where it's like, if you do kind of get the combo out and you do lock your opponent down, you're kind of just going to win, but it's a little bit inconsistent in that approach. There certainly are some decks that maybe have free retreat or maybe don't require a ton of energy, so that is somewhat of an upside to those decks when you're playing against Banette, but enough decks of the format either have high retreat costs, aren't playing retreat cards, or need a lot of energies to do anything, and I think that's really where Banette kind of fits in pretty well. It's going to go in the B tier, quite frankly. So next up, what we have is, again, sort of a flex archetype. This is Tapu Lele and Oricorio. Tons of different ways that you can play this particular package. And like I said, these two cards were seeing play in this Banette list, and we do have Gengar on this tier list as well as Togekiss, which are all decks that do play this Tapu Lele Oricorio combination. But I think that I wanted to make a separate tier for this combo because it really is kind of the core of the deck when you think about it, right? It's kind of like that Giratina and Greninja combination to some degree. You can play it with Snorlax, you can play with Oricorio, you can play it with Tapu Lele. But Tapu Lele Oricorio, I'm putting this as sort of an aggro psychic archetype. Again, you can play it with Banette, you can play it with Gengar, you could play it with Mimikyu, you could even play it with Giratina. There's a lot of psychic Pokemon that just pair well when you pair it with Tapu Lele and Oricorio. This archetype here is all of those decks that's a little bit more focused around that particular Tapu Lele aggro combination. And again, I do think that it's actually really, really good. And it's worth mentioning as well. That's why it's on the tier list this week. Just a ton of different Pokemon and decks are kind of utilizing this combination. So we're going to go ahead and put it also in the B tier. This might be a bit redundant, but I think that there's just so many really good B tier decks that just, again, aren't like something that see a ton of play. And again, B tier isn't like a bad ranking. Like, what people might be, I guess, disappointed to see certain decks in the B tier, but again, a lot of B tier decks end up kind of winning or doing really well. In fact, like last week, Magnezone and Oricorio, I put in the B tier, and it ended up winning the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time. And again, so B tier isn't a place where bad decks go. It's just a place where like it's hard for us to really justify, you know, putting them in those higher tiers, but they still certainly are really, really strong decks. And that's where these are going to go. So the Aggro, Tapu Lele, Oricorio package, again, no matter how you're playing it with Mimikyu, with Togekiss, with Gengar, with whatever, it is just certainly really, really good against a variety of Pokemon in the format. Kind of one of the only sort of true like single prize sort of packages that continues to do really well, other than maybe I don't even know, I suppose. Like, that's kind of it. It's really the only pairing that we see oftentimes. Like, there's like the Greninja, like Oricorio package, of course, that does really well. Rampardos is a single prize Pokemon, so you could guess, like, quantify that with like Lucario as well. So there's some, but like for the most part, this is kind of it, and it's kind of at the top in terms of like a combination of non-EX Pokemon that is consistently doing well. We're gonna go ahead and put it in the B tier. Next up, we've got Beedrill. Now, Beedrill can come in a variety of different forms. You can play just sort of straight Beedrill, or you can pair it with Meowscarada. You can really pair Beedrill in a lot of different ways. This list, or this particular deck on the tier list, is going to be Beedrill with Meowscarada. Now, Beedrill and Meowscarada did have at least one placement in Top Cut, and Beedrill as well is one of those decks where I feel like, you know, Beedrill's totally fine. I think it's been like B or C tier for like the last couple of weeks now, but I think in the current format right now and how well positioned Meowscarada is, Beedrill being paired with Meowscarada is certainly like the best way we do that. Again, we'll get into the, you know, Meowscarada sort of grass talks here in a little bit, because I think that Meowscarada is a phenomenal card and it's very well positioned in the format, and this week it kind of showed. But again, whether we're pairing it with Decidueye or Beedrill, it necessarily doesn't matter that much. I will say that Decidueye in my mind is sort of a better combination for Beedrill, but really all of the Meowscarada decks I think right now are going to do really well, considering all of the other decks that are kind of at the top of the metagame. Meowscarada is just tremendously well positioned. It does have its struggles, of course. If we are leading off with Beedrill, you know, it's one of those things where it's pretty good early. It's not as good late game, but late game is fine because, you know, we're probably going to get carried by Meowscarada anyway. So grass in general is just a really well positioned archetype. The difference between Beedrill and Decidueye, of course, not only about the amount of damage that they do, but it's realistically about how much, you know, like, I guess how relevant like their attacks are, right? If you're discarding energies and doing 80 damage with Beedrill, that certainly is really good. It kind of acts like Banette, where you can kind of lock in a Pokemon in the active spot and they can't really do anything, because if they don't have a way to attach an additional energy, or if they're not at the amount of energy that they need to attack, then you've effectively just kind of KO'd whatever is in the active spot. And that certainly is really, really good, but I do think that Decidueye doing 100 damage potentially to a bench Pokemon is just a bit better. It also, I think in general, is just a stronger Pokemon. So I like Beedrill. Again, are we going to put Beedrill again in the B tier? This is just going to be every deck in the B tier in this video. You know, it's tough to say. It really is. There was not a lot of Beedrill representation. It's similar to like Infernape, in fact. I'm going to put them right next to each other because I think that Beedrill and Infernape are kind of two peas in a pod in a way, where I think there's better options in their respective typing. I think that they operate in similar kind of fashions in the metagame, meaning like, you know, Beedrill's really good and it's got a good partner, and it's well positioned because of its partner, and of course Beedrill isn't a bad Pokemon. And it's the same with like Infernape, where it's like, I think just sort of the meta kind of like as not necessarily settled on these Pokemon, but they kind of do find a little place, right? There was one Incineroar in Top Cut of the tournament. There was one Beedrill in Top Cut, but a lot more representation of their respective counterparts of their typings that are just a little bit better. Like for Infernape, of course, we have Charizard, we have Incineroar, and then for Beedrill, of course, we have like Decidueye, right? Which is just sort of like the better option. But I would say this deck probably got carried a bit by Meowscarada. I'm going to put it in the B tier, and I am. Trust me, there's going to be decks in other tiers other than the B tier, I promise you that. But grass in general, very well positioned, so I think it definitely deserves a nice sort of B tier slot. Okay, next up, we've got Giratina and Darkrai. So here's the deal, right? And I'm just sort of coming at this from a perspective of what's relevant right now in the metagame, what the positioning of these decks are currently in the metagame. Giratina and Darkrai has been an S tier choice in my mind for the last couple of weeks. Now, it hasn't won a tournament yet, I don't believe, but it's gotten like top cut at basically all of the tournaments. Now, Giratina and Darkrai did get 7th place at this largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time, but you would think that being the most played deck, it maybe would have a little bit more of representation at the top of the leaderboards. But here's the thing. I do think that Giratina and Darkrai is finally kind of being pushed out of the format at least a little bit right now. I thought that this would happen a bit earlier with the inclusion of Rare Candy making Stage 2 decks a little bit better, as well as Oricorio entering into the format. I just thought that things wouldn't be as strong for Giratina and Darkrai, but for whatever the reason, it just didn't really matter. And yes, some people are playing Giratina Giratina Darkrai with Kamala. Some people are playing it with Greninja, but inherently the core of the deck is still probably the strongest core in Pokemon Pocket. But again, we're not talking about things in a vacuum. What we're talking about is how well things are positioned and how good are they in the format right now. And I do think that the format has kind of come around finally. And for whatever the reason, it took 3 weeks, but eventually, I think that the metagame right now isn't as friendly to Giratina and Darkrai as it maybe has been. And I'm not even saying that it's been friendly to Giratina and Darkrai since the beginning of Celestial Guardians, but I think now finally the actual kind of core metagame is sort of built in a way that is necessarily not kind in general to Giratina and Darkrai, which is a good thing because this is a deck list that is inherently really good. I do think that if you take a look at the format in general and you think like, why are some decks seeing play and why some decks are doing well? Again, a big reason why Grass was so good into the format this week was because the most played deck was Giratina and Darkrai, and there was a lot of Oricorio, a lot of Tapu Lele, things like that, where Meowscarada really had an opportunity to shine. And for that reason, I do think that the amount of people playing Giratina and Darkrai will likely decrease. But one thing is for certain is that this is still one of the strongest decks in Pokemon Pocket. If we're talking about ranked battles and Master Ball climbing, a lot of the top players are still playing it. It's probably the most consistent strategy in the game. Incredibly flexible with only 16 trainer cards, or with 16 trainer cards that we can play. If we're not playing, of course, Kamala or Greninja or anything like that. Our deck is super flexible. We can play a ton of those ancillary trainer cards and potentially build our deck to hopefully kind of counterplay whatever we've seen. That's one thing that I was kind of surprised to see. You know, if Giratina and Darkrai decided to play like double red card, double Mars, then yeah, you know, it might actually have a fairly decent chance against Meowscarada. It's interesting nonetheless. One thing I will say is that this is still an incredibly strong deck, but much less well-positioned than it has been in previous weeks. Now, again, I'm not building the tier list directly off of the results from the tournament, that's for sure. I'm kind of looking forward ahead as to what the format will look like because of how the tournament wrapped up. And again, I just kind of feel like we're finally out of the S tier for Giratina and Darkrai. That's my opinion. It's probably going to go high A tier. Still an incredibly strong deck. It did have a 48% win rate in this past weekend's tournament, being the most played deck, and that is a little bit underwhelming, truthfully. It's kind of the first time we've seen Giratina and Darkrai have a below 50% win rate, and I think that that means a lot. I think that it does mean that I think the format right now is finally not a great place to be playing Giratina and Darkrai, at least in a tournament setting. In ranked battles, it might be different with the high variety of decks that you play. We're going to go ahead and put it in the A tier right now. Now, honestly, at the top of my head, I don't know if we're going to be putting any decks in the S tier. We'll have to wait and see. But anyway, next up we've got, well, actually, yeah, let's just do it right now. We've got Decidueye and Meowscarada. This is the big one currently in the format right now. By far the most successful deck of the largest tournament ever this past weekend. Now, when I say most successful, I don't mean the highest placing deck. Of course, Magnezone and Oricorio did win the tournament, but when you take a look at the decks that made day 2 and the distribution of decks that I guess did better than all of the other decks in day 1, you really kind of see that Meowscarada and Decidueye was not only the best choice, but by far the most successful deck overall in the tournament. It did get second place and third place. It was the most popular deck in day 2, only being 11% of the meta share, but 27% of the day 2 meta share, which is a massive increase. Just massively well positioned, I think, going into this tournament. And I think that it's safe to say that this will probably stick around. I think that these grass decks are inherently flawed in how the decks function. And again, if we're talking about decks in a vacuum, this is certainly a really strong deck, but it's a little bit more of a late game deck. It's a little bit more of an inconsistent deck. There's a lot of hand disruption in the format. There's still a lot of fire seeing play in the format, which of course we don't like to go up against. And of course we like to go second when we're not very great going first. So, you know, it's one of those things where it's the difference between, you know, choosing to play a deck in a tournament and choosing to play a deck maybe when you're grinding Master Ball rank. I think that Decidueye with Meowscarada is certainly one of the best decks in the game right now, but it really is hard for me to justify kind of putting it into the S tier, even though it was by far the most successful deck. Like, if you were to like fast forward to next week, we will probably see a lot more people playing Magnezone and Oricorio, which of course is a really strong Oricorio deck that is specifically good against Meowscarada, and we're probably going to see more fire decks as well, which are going to be strong against grass. So it is a little bit hard for me to justify, or I guess sort of explain and put it into the S tier, given I don't think it's going to have nearly as good of a week next week as it will this week. It's also not a great pick, I don't think. Well, it's definitely a good pick, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's my #1 pick for Master Ball rank and for ranked battles. Maybe in the lower ranks, it's still good. I think that Meowscarada and Decidueye is certainly one of the top decks of the format, but we're going to go ahead and put it into the A tier. Again, similar to Giratina and Darkrai, but again, in the head-to-head, it's certainly really good. Again, it had a 54% win rate, by far the highest out of any of the top decks of the format right now. I think it's exceptionally really strong, and I do think that it's certainly a great choice. But again, it's hard for me to say that even after its performance in this past weekend in the largest tournament of all time, it's hard for me to justify putting it into that S tier slot. The S tier is really what I believe to be by far and away like the best options, and I think that by the time next week rolls around, we're going to see a lot of rebound effect in terms of how the metagame looks like and how certain decks are positioned. I think that this was like the perfect week for Meowscarada and Decidueye. Given the decks that saw the most play of the tournament, it was certainly the best meta choice, and it was reflected, I think, in the results. But I think in the next weeks, it'll probably kind of comfortably sit into the A tier, and that's kind of how I feel about it. So yeah, sorry to disappoint anybody, but it's a high A tier pick for me. We're gonna put it at the top. All right, next up is Gallade. Now, we haven't been talking about Gallade really at all. Now, it was a deck that did make top cut. There was, I think, one player that made top cut of this tournament playing Gallade. It really didn't see a ton of play. 10 people played Gallade and Rampardos. However, it did have a very good win rate in that small sample size at a 57.5%, 39 wins, 27 losses. Again, out of 10 players, one of them did make top cut. And that certainly is impressive. Now, we got to look back and think to ourselves, why did Gallade see so much play, and why did it see so much success? And, you know, it's interesting. I think that Gallade isn't a bad Pokemon whatsoever. I think you do have a little bit of leeway having a Pokemon, both two fighting Pokemon that are weak to, one is weak to Psychic and one is weak to Grass, which you can kind of kind of hedge your bets a little bit as to what matchups you're going up against. But also, if you take a look at the other decks in the format that see a lot of play, against Fire, Gallade's certainly going to be pretty decent against things like Charizard. Against Magnezone, it certainly is fairly good as well. And again, we do have Rampardos for Oricorio. So in certain matchups, I think that Gallade is actually a little bit better than some of the other fighting decks, but it's really hard for me. Again, we're in a position to where this is another deck that kind of crept into the metagame a little bit this week, had a pretty good outing, a pretty good performance, but didn't see enough play or enough success for me to really kind of surge it high up on the tier list. I mean, we haven't even included Gallade in the last couple of tier lists, so we can't go from not being on the tier list to going into like A tier or S tier, but I actually think Gallade is a little bit slept on. And again, for whatever the reason, the way that the format is panning out right now, I think that Gallade is actually a bit better than what it was early on. And I think that's a little bit surprising. We're going to go ahead and put it in the B tier. Shout out to Gallade going into the B tier. I think it's certainly a decent deck. Fairly well positioned. Again, I think it's just, for whatever the reason, a fairly decent choice as far as the fighting decks go. But we have quite a bit of fighting decks on the tier list, so we'll get into it in just a little bit. Next up is Gengar. Now, Gengar, again, it's just something that people still play. This week, it actually did a little bit better than the previous weeks. There's a lot of different ways that we can play Gengar. I believe this is going to be Gengar EX with the Bother Gengar. So this is sort of the control sort of supporter lock Gengar lineup, which is still a fine deck list. Now, I think the highest rating or the highest ranking Gengar from the tournament was actually the one from Shining Revelry, I believe it was, or maybe one of the more recent sets that just did 70 damage and then it put your opponent to sleep, and it was paired with Tapu Lele and Oricorio. That particular Gengar archetype is kind of packaged into this deck here, the aggro kind of Tapu Lele Oricorio archetype. This is different. This is like pure Gengar with Gengar EX. And again, people still play it, still a good deck list, still quality. It's just not something that I think will ever really kind of rise high up in the format. We've talked about it week after week. I think that Gengar is fine. You know, it really is. I think it just doesn't do enough damage, and it's not as consistent enough to get that effect in play. If we do get the Bother Gengar out, of course, we're only doing like 30 damage, but we do get the supporter lockdown. But if we do go into Gengar EX, we can't attack until we have 3 energies, and then when we do attack, it's only 100 damage. A lot of Stage 2 Pokemon playing things like Giant Cape, like Leaf Cape, like Lele. So a lot of times we're not even 2-KOing Pokemon, and we're most of the time having to KO Pokemon in 3 attacks, which realistically doesn't feel very good, especially considering the fact that, you know, they're just going to be drawing enough cards and they don't necessarily need their supporters. Item lock, in theory, would be much better than supporter lock. And we do have an item lock Pokemon in the new Vikavolt, but it also doesn't really see play. So I think that this particular Gengar deck is, again, totally fine, totally decent. It's going to go into the C tier. I think it's a really decent C tier pick. I think it's been like D tier in the previous weeks. And I think I kind of made a joke last week of like, oh, why is Gengar on the tier list? Well, it's here to go into the D tier. I think it's not necessarily a D tier deck. I think we got to give it at least a little bit of credit. And again, when you look at the decks in the metagame, like I'm definitely reserving D tier for the decks that truthfully should not see play, but people still play them. And yeah, so that's sort of how I feel about Gengar. I think it's okay. I think it's better than it maybe was in previous weeks, but anyway. Next up, we've got Greninja and Oricorio. This is a deck list that's kind of fallen from grace a little bit. I think that if you really look at the tournament results over the last sort of 3 weeks, we see that Magnezone and Oricorio not only got second, I believe, at the first Ursa Days tournament, but it ended up getting first at the largest tournament of all time. So that being said, there's really two kind of pure Oricorio archetypes. And for us, it's a little bit hard. And again, we have this on the tier list twice, but we're not going to rank this one. We're going to rank this one here. I probably should have changed that from last week, but this is Greninja with Oricorio and Giratina. Really the one of two ways that people are playing Oricorio. I do think that this deck list is going to see a massive drop in play, significantly for the reason that it's just not very good against the grass archetypes and against Meowscarada. Meowscarada is just something that's going to outperform Oricorio. It's got more HP. We have Leaf Cape. We've got Erica's. So even though we do have some flexibility with the Greninja Pings and Cyrus, and of course we still do have Giratina, it just doesn't really matter. In the head-to-head matchup against the grass decks, this deck definitely struggles. And I think we've seen that reflected in the results over the last couple of weeks. It, in my mind, was an S-tier pick in the first couple of weeks. It's really is an incredible deck list, but unfortunately, with grass seeing so much play, you just can't really justify playing Oricorio this way. If you do want to play Oricorio, you have to play it with Magnezone in a format that's seeing a ton of Meowscarada play. So for that reason, I think that it's seen a bit of a fall from grace. Again, it was the 5th most played deck of this past weekend, and it did have a 45.5% win rate, which is definitely low. Much lower than we would really consider putting this deck any higher than something like a B tier, which is where it's going. Truthfully, I think it's a really, really fine deck. But again, the amount of decks that see play and which decks are seeing play definitely changes the landscape of the format. And I think grass really surging in terms of its play really does showcase how not well positioned this deck is against certain decks and against certain, positions in the metagame. If grass really wasn't a deck that saw any play, if it was all fire, if it was all Giratina, all Darkrai, things like that, I think that this Oricorio deck would be phenomenal, and it was in the last couple of weeks, but things are definitely changing a lot, at least I think going into this week, but also coming out of this weekend. For that reason, Greninja with Oricorio and Giratina is still a fine deck, but a massive drop-off from where it was. I believe we had it in an S tier previously, but that's what happens. Things change a ton. When Meowscarada goes from, 2% of the meta share to 12 or 15% of the meta share, certain decks are going to be affected by it. This is certainly one of those decks, so it's got to go right there into the B tier. It may completely fall out of favor in favor of Magnezone and Oricorio, but again, depending on how the meta shifts, it could kind of rise back up and play. Now, one thing I will say, a bit of a tangent, we should be getting an announcement for the next mini set in the next week or so. So that is actually a really big deal, meaning that this format as it is right now, which is very far from being figured out, evolving rapidly as time goes on, is going to be changing very, very quickly in the next week or two. We're going to have a completely new format with new cards and a new expansion coming out. So yeah, Greninja Oricorio, it's going into the B tier this week. A massive drop off from the previous weeks, but that's sort of what happens sometimes, right? Next up is Magnezone and Oricorio. Okay, all right. So here's the deal. It did win the Ursa Days tournament. However, only 26 people played it, and that's about 1% of the meta share from this large tournament, the largest tournament ever. And it had a 50% win rate, which is, again, good. It's good. It's not great, but it did win the tournament. Now, we talked about this in Meta Monday yesterday. The big reason why this deck won the tournament was because in Top Cut, it got a little bit lucky and it played almost exclusively Giratina Darkrai decks or Meowscarada decks, which it has a very good matchup against. And you might be thinking to yourself, all right, well, I mean, if the deck is really good against sort of the decks that are seeing the most play, then it certainly should be one of the most well-positioned decks in the format, you would think, right? And yeah, it kind of is. So it's interesting to me. I was going to avoid putting this in the S tier, mainly because I don't like to put decks in the S tier just because they won tournaments. But the thing is, if we're looking ahead and we're I guess sort of thinking about what decks are going to see a lot of play, I do expect Magnezone and Oricorio to probably take the place of Greninja and Oricorio, meaning it'll probably go from about 1% meta share close to about 7 or 8% meta share of this upcoming weekend. And if enough people play this deck list, I'm actually not going to be too surprised if it ends up winning again or doing really well. So this is a deck that I think we put in the B tier of the previous week, because again, without all of the grass decks, there really wasn't a great place for Magnezone and Oricorio. And I think that that's the big difference with grass seeing so much play currently in the format, is that what it does is it really declines the Greninja Oricorio Giratina variant, but it really kind of skyrockets the Magnezone variant. It's really unique in the sense that it is kind of one of the few decks that you can play Oricorio, but it's really the only deck, in fact, where you can play Oricorio and still have all of those really good matchups because you're playing Oricorio, but still have a really good matchup into the Meowscarada grass decks. It's really unique in that sense. So it has a very kind of particular niche position in the format right now. It might be a little bit jumping the gun to put this deck in the S tier, which is why I'm a little bit contemplating doing that. I'm in between right now, where you're looking at this in live time. The gears are turning, and I'm kind of deciding where to rank this deck. Honestly, I don't really know. I think what we're gonna do probably is we're probably gonna put it in the S tier. And again, it's not because it got first place. I think it got first place because it's positioned in the metagame, and I think that if the metagame really does kind of evolve in a way that we expect it to over the next week, I do think that Magnezone Oricorio will likely be the most, I guess, probably the most well-positioned deck in that sense, where, if Giratina still sees a ton of play, and Grass continues to see a lot of play, which it probably will, I think that this deck list will be in a really, really good position. Now, one thing I will say is that the fighting decks are kind of eating pretty good right now. I think we have sort of this new rock, paper, scissors type formulation right now, where we have grass decks. Like, if you talk about this sort of rock, paper, scissors formation, again, at the top of the metagame, it's shifting in a really weird sense. And I think what we're probably going to see for the next upcoming week is that rock, paper, scissors kind of formulation between the grass decks here in Meowscarada and Decidueye, as well as, Magnezone and Oricorio. But the decks that do well against Magnezone and Oricorio, being these fighting decks, I think are really where we're going to see that kind of, full kind of cycle of 3 decks that do really well against each other. So it's interesting. We could go ahead and put some of these fighting decks in the S tier, and we could say, you know what? If a ton of people are, again, playing Magnezone and Oricorio, and a ton of people are maybe playing, I guess, Decidueye, then it kind of evens out a little bit, and that's kind of where I feel about the fighting decks. It's like, they certainly could just win the next tournament, being sort of the counter meta play. We see that all the time in tournaments, right? The decks that do good against the deck that does well against all of the other decks in the tournament is the deck that ends up kind of winning, right? We've seen that with Snorlax, with Tapu Lele, now with Magnezone and Oricorio. So I think being on that counter meta kind of category does position you really well from a tournament perspective, but this isn't all about tournaments. This is just about in general. If I'm playing a deck like on the Master Ball ladder, or if I'm kind of going into a tournament, I do think that Garchomp is really, really good. But you know what? I'm actually going to put it up here into A tier, specifically because we should definitely lose to grass. We looked that up on Meta Monday. We have like a 26% win rate against Meowscarada and Decidueye, which I think is really the one thing holding it back, which is really where Gallade kind of comes in handy, right? We're going to be decent against Magnezone and Oricorio for sure, being fighting type, but we're not necessarily exclusively weak to grass. Rampardos is weak to grass, but that's not a big deal because we're not an EX Pokemon. So Meowscarada only hits us for 80, and we hit Meowscarada for 130. So Rampardos is really, really pretty good actually into Meowscarada, whereas Garchomp certainly isn't. And you could say, like, well, then shouldn't Gallade also be A tier? Maybe, but again, it's just hard for us to put it in A tier given, like how much play it saw. Like, I don't know if Gallade will really kind of catch on, but it certainly is a lot more well-positioned than you might think. And that's, I think, the only thing holding Garchomp back is that certainly going to see a lot more Magnezone Oricorio. There's still going to be a lot of Giratina decks floating around. Garchomp does pretty well. It's got respectable matchups and all of that stuff, but it's always going to be held back by grass, and if grass sees a ton of play, then I just don't necessarily expect fighting to see that much play. We could even justify putting it here into the B tier, but I think it's good enough. It really depends, like how much people play grass as opposed to how much people play Magnezone and Oricorio. That's really what it comes down to. So I think A tier is kind of a comfortable choice for Garchomp and Rampardos, and the other fighting decks are similar. There are other Rampardos decks. There's quite a few. Truthfully, we've got Lucario and Rampardos, which, to be fair, I don't think is necessarily as good as the other variants. And we also have Lycanroc and Rampardos. Let's talk about Lycanroc first, because Lycanroc is something that I think is in a weird position, kind of, is what I'll say. Some people are playing Lycanroc Rampardos with Aerodactyl. In other tier lists in previous weeks, I've kind of separated those two. But this week, I'm really condensing it. So really, any Rampardos deck that's playing Lycanroc is just kind of falling under this category. And it's certainly a fine deck list. But again, Lycanroc, I believe, is weak to grass. I believe it might be weak to... It's weak to grass, for sure. And so is... Well, Aerodactyl is actually weak to Psych, Electric. So that's a little bit of a difference. But anyway... The fighting Pokemon are weird. They all have different weaknesses, right? Because you've got like rock, you've got ground, you've got fighting. It's a little bit different. But anyway, Rampardos and Lycanroc I think is totally fine. Now, these are decks that really haven't seen much play. I think Garchomp really kind of took over that #1 slot in terms of fighting decks, and it consistently does have the highest win rate. I think that Gallade kind of might take over as that secondary option as far as, like, if you're playing a fighting deck with Rampardos and you don't want to necessarily play Garchomp, I think Gallade might actually be that #1 option. So what we're going to do is we're going to put Lycanroc and Rampardos also in the B tier, but I'm going to put it below Gallade. That's why I moved Gallade up here. I think Gallade is like higher B tier, and Rampardos with Lycanroc is like lower B tier. Again, much weaker against Meowscarada than particularly Gallade would be. And then we have Lucario and Rampardos, which I think is kind of in general just fallen off. I think for a lot of different reasons, with maybe Tapu Lele seeing a lot of play. I don't think that Lucario is a great choice. So I'm actually going to go ahead and put it in the C tier. So that's where we're really sitting. 4 different fighting decks. But I do think that the two that might kind of be more worth playing right now are going to be sort of the big guys here with Garchomp, or if you wanted to kind of divert that grass weakness, you could play Gallade, even though it's necessarily not as strong as of a Pokemon. But if Giratina sees a lot less play, then maybe Gallade is a little bit more worth running. So keep that in mind. But all of the other ones, like Rampardos with Lycanroc, with all of the grassing play, I don't think it's a really good pick. In fact, I might also actually just put it into the C tier. That might be kind of a split decision, but yeah. Yeah, that's where I'm kind of feeling about the fighting decks, honestly. This is a harder tier list to do this week than previous weeks, for sure. Just because so much has changed, but we're also really far into the format, so there's a lot of like stuff from previous formats that we still have to keep in mind. We can't be like a little bit too, you know, we can't just pull the trigger on these decks too quickly, because you know, 1 week doesn't necessarily mean everything, but it definitely does give us a lot of information. I think Garchomp is still a really, really strong deck. Like in a vacuum, I think it's the strongest option. Even with grassing a ton of play, it could potentially be like an S tier choice, but I think for right now, A tier is pretty comfortable. Gallade potentially could be an A tier pick, but I don't know if it's really going to see as much play as maybe it should, so it's going to stay in the B tier. And then the other Rampardos decks with Lycanroc or Lucario, I think are truthfully just really something I would avoid playing for a variety of different reasons. I think Lucario has definitely struggled for the last couple of weeks, again, with all of the different psychic decks that are kind of flying around for sure. But I also think that Lycanroc is also going to be struggling quite a bit because of all of the grass. So yeah, that's sort of where that's kind of where I feel about the fighting decks. Yeah. Okay. There you go. I don't know. It was kind of awkward. I just kind of threw them on the tier list at one time, but that's where I feel about them. So that's where they're going to go. All right. What's up next? We've got Togekiss. Shout out to Togekiss, because this is a deck that for some reason always ends up ranking fairly high. It never sees that much play. Like, it never does. It's never a deck that like people really kind of like lean into, and then like more people start to play it, and then it goes down. It's always like a deck that like 1% or 0.5% of the meta share plays, but there's always at least one player that does well with it. The upside to Togekiss is that Solgaleo is realistically a deck that nobody really plays anymore. It's just not something that's very viable into the metagame. So Togekiss doesn't really have a lot of weaknesses. We're weak to metal, but we have 140 HP, but that's fine, because like with Giant Cape and things like that, we're kind of just alive. Even maybe the deck doesn't play Giant Cape, but we're kind of living most hits from most Pokemon. And then of course we have that Tapu Lele Oricorio package, which we talked about earlier, which is just a really, really good combination. So Togekiss to me has been slowly climbing the ranks as far as the tier lists go. It's gone from like D tier to C tier, and I'm kind of feeling B tier this week. And again, it feels like one of those decks where, again, not many people are playing it. It just isn't something that sees a ton of play, but consistently has decent win rates and decent performances, despite people just realistically not playing it very often. And I think that's pretty interesting. So it's going to go into the B tier with all of those other decks that are always really decent options, but just for whatever reason, never really catch on, but always kind of find their way. They kind of squeeze their way into like a top cut or a decent placement. And that's how I feel about our guy Togekiss, right? So shout out to Togekiss. And I know some people love it, some people play it. Again, it's hard. It's kind of that perfect example of a deck where I think it's totally fine. In fact, I kind of would recommend it to some degree, but it's hard for me to like, again, just sort of really, really justify its placement based off of how many people are playing it. I do think it's good. It's going to go into the B tier for sure. Okay, let's talk about the Solgaleo decks next, because this is something that I think a lot of people might be a little bit disappointed to see. Solgaleo has been dropping not only in play, but in success and in winner rates, everything. It started off as a deck that I think was fairly decent early on, especially against maybe some of the Oricorio decks. Skarmory was certainly a decent option, but I think that no matter how you look at the format right now, no matter how you justify Solgaleo's placement, it's just something that isn't that good. You know, it's just really not that good. 120, again, is a bit of an awkward number, because it does put us in a pretty awkward spot with a lot of the Giant Capes and Leaf Capes and, you know, the healing cards that are in these Stage 2 decks. A lot of times we're not even 2-hit KOing Pokemon, and that just generally feels really bad. I think if we're going to play something like Solgaleo, even though it does have a little bit more of a fast-paced potential, if we are going second, of course, we can attack Solgaleo on our second turn, and we do have the flexibility to play Pokemon that we don't necessarily have to retreat, but that typically doesn't matter, because it's not like we have a great like lead-off Pokemon that can kind of utilize that free retreat aspect of Solgaleo. The best way to play it probably is still with Skarmory, because Skarmory is a decent Pokemon, but it's like, it doesn't matter. It basically means that Solgaleo's effect just doesn't really matter anyway, because we're going to be attaching to Skarmory and leading off with that sort of fast-paced damage, and then just going into Solgaleo late game. But we already have the energy on Skarmory, so that free retreat ability doesn't really matter. I think in a world where maybe we get a really, really strong metal-type Pokemon that can act as sort of that lead-off option to Solgaleo, as sort of that wall, then that could be a totally different scenario, and Solgaleo could be really, really good. I think it's kind of similar to like Dialga when Dialga EX first came out. It just doesn't have like a great partner, and Metal is in an awkward spot because we are weak to Fire, and Fire still sees a decent amount of play, and we're not hitting really anything for weakness, right? That's one thing you got to keep in mind with the Metal decks is like, sure, we are hitting the fairy Pokemon like Togekiss for weakness, but very few and far between. And yes, I guess we're KOing or we're hitting Togekiss for weakness, but Skarmory only does 70 damage with weakness, and then Solgaleo's one-hit KOing Tapu Lele anyway. So that weakness doesn't really matter. There's really no like super relevant Pokemon where that weakness kind of comes in handy. If like the top deck of the format was like a really strong stage 2 Pokemon that was being hit for weakness to Metal, then, you know, Solgaleo doing 140, that's 280 and 2 attacks, that would be a big difference, right? But it's just not the case. Solgaleo realistically just isn't that good. Now the Skarmory variant, which is what we're going to rank first, Skarmory is, I still think, better than Snorlax. Snorlax saw some play with Giratina, but inherently it's a little bit inconsistent. And again, I just can't really justify putting Solgaleo super high on the tier list. For reference, if we take a look at the data just from this past weekend, Solgaleo was like the 8th or 9th most played deck. It was 2% of the meta share, and it had a 39% win rate. That's with Skarmory. So 60 people played this deck out of like 3,000, less than a 40% win rate, 2% of the meta share. I mean, it really is not a good choice. I love Solgaleo, and I wish it was better. But again, we have to look at the data that's available to us, and Solgaleo isn't. It's just not something that I can recommend truthfully to you guys. We're gonna go ahead and put it in the C tier. Now we also have Snorlax and Solgaleo, which sees a lot less play. Only 11 people played it of this tournament. Now it did have a better win rate. It had a 46% win rate, but I also just don't really feel that strongly about it. We're going to put it like a higher than Skarmory and Solgaleo, but I think it's also kind of a C tier deck. And again, the C tier is sort of a tier where I would say these are real decks that are in the metagame that can win games, but when you take a look at all of the other decks that are potentially viable in the metagame, they all just do a little bit better currently than the C tier decks. Some people are going to be disappointed about that. They're going to be like, how is Togekiss or Banette higher up than Solgaleo? But again, it literally is. The decks in the B tier, even though they probably see a lot less play than Solgaleo, are literally better than Solgaleo. It's just one of those things where people still like playing Solgaleo and they want to play it. So they do play it, and then they just end up not doing very well with it. One Solgaleo did make top cut, but that doesn't really say too much considering how many people played it, right? So I don't know. I mean, Solgaleo's fine. It's just not, I can't recommend it. I can't recommend you play Solgaleo right now into this format. I really, really can't. So there it goes. It's going to go chilling right there into the C tier. Some people are going to be super upset about that. I know they will be. It's totally a fine deck. It's just not, I can't. I can't. It's got to go C tier. I can't even consider putting it in the B tier given what it's done over the last few weeks. And it's only seeing a decline in play and a decline in win rate. So it's pretty bad, quite frankly. Okay. What do we have next? The Solgaleo people are going to be mad. What do we have next? We've got Mewtwo. So Mewtwo and Gardevoir. Now, this is something that was, again, kind of fringe meta early in the format. Something that saw a little bit of play, but not something that ever saw a ton of play, never had a ton of success. When we take a look at how it performed this weekend, which is really all we have to go off of based around the current metagame and the current format, 9 people play this deck, so very much not many people, and it had a 29% win rate. This deck went 13 and 32 out of the 9 people that played it. That is pretty bad. And I thought to myself, like, why is that the case? I mean, Mewtwo is still fairly strong. I think that it comes down to, like, you know, what's being played in the metagame. Of course, Oricorio sees a lot of play, and we do have Gardevoir to deal with Oricorio, but a lot of Oricorio decks now are playing things like Magnezone, or, of course, playing Shaman to heal, or they're maybe playing Greninja. So there's a lot of ways that the Oricorio decks can kind of just go through Gardevoir, and Mewtwo itself, of course, not being able to hit Oricorio, but also kind of just getting dominated by a variety of different Pokemon. Particularly the grass decks is kind of what I look at when I take a look at Mewtwo, because Mewtwo hits for 150, and with red that is 170, but take a look at Meowscarada with Leaf Cape, goes to 170, hits for 130. In that grass matchup, I really don't think that Mewtwo does well at all. And then you kind of look at everything else in the format, and you're like, well, like, what is Mewtwo really doing well against? Not much, truthfully. Mewtwo just really isn't very well positioned. And it kind of makes sense, to be fair. And I feel a little bit bad doing it, but Mewtwo is actually going to go into the D tier this week. Again, primarily based off of its performance from this weekend. And that's tough to say, but you know, I mean, come on, 29% win rate for a deck that only 9 people played is bad, you know, and it's on the tier list. This is a deck that could completely fall off the tier list in subsequent weeks. I think we've had this like maybe in the C tier, maybe B tier early on in the format. Right now, it's feeling like a very, very strong D tier pick. And that's kind of why I kept it on the tier list this week, because it really was one of those decks where, you know, it was a great example for us to put it onto the D tier. A lot of the decks that might have gone D tier this week just were left off of the tier list because they weren't worth necessarily talking about. So if you're thinking about why isn't like X or, you know, this deck or that deck on the tier list this week, that's honestly because it probably would have either gone in the D tier or it just really wasn't anything that anybody played or did well with. So keep that in mind. If a deck's missing from the tier list, it's probably because it really is kind of off the tier list in terms of it's like below D tier. Okay, what do we have next? We've got Meowscarada with Tsareena. So Meowscarada and Tsareena is, again, another kind of weird fringe pick. This is a deck that I think a lot of people have really dropped. Originally Grass was very spread out early in the format. And we talked about that. Like, I think our first tier list had like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 different Grass decks. And this week, it's just a lot different. And I did want to keep it on the tier list because it is, I think, one of the Grass decks that people are playing. But when you take a look at the Grass decks and you see that Meowscarada and Decidueye is certainly that #1 Grass deck option, a lot of the other Grass decks have really kind of fallen out of favor. Not that they're that bad, it's just they're maybe not as good as Decidueye and Meowscarada, which means that they certainly just see less play overall. Tsareena isn't a bad card. It certainly is a card that can win games, but it's damage off of coin flips, and Meowscarada is really carrying the deck anyway, and we would probably rather play Decidueye than Tsareena in most scenarios. So I think this is a deck that still people played. I believe 7 people played it in the tournament. It had a 43% win rate. It went 15 and 20, which is like, again, it's a small sample size, so it's hard to justify, those numbers really at all. But when we take a look at the format overall, I think that Grass is somewhat fairly well positioned. I don't think that Tsareena really helps your Magnezone matchup that much, you know? Like, yes, technically, we can do more damage against Magnezone than Meowscarada can, but Magnezone does 110 guaranteed with 140 HP, so it's just a little bit better in that sense. So, I don't know. We're going to go ahead and put this, like, high C tier. I think it's probably a decent deck list, but considering the fact that most people and basically everybody that's playing Grass are probably going to be playing Decidueye and Meowscarada, just doesn't leave a lot of room for us to really justify playing Tsareena with Meowscarada. So it's going to go right there into the C tier. Not bad enough to go into the D tier by any means, but just really not something that, you know, I would say is a decent choice. Now, if you don't have Decidueye, I would actually recommend playing Beedrill over Tsareena. But if you don't have either of them, or if you just really like Tsareena, then you can play it. It certainly is still a deck, but not something that I would really put too much stock in or you know, consider to be like super, super high on the old rankings list. Okay, what do we got next? We actually have a lot of heavy hitters to finish this tier list, so we got to move a little bit quickly. We're already at like 45 minutes. I haven't been looking at the clock. We're way too behind schedule on this. All right, let's move a little bit quickly here. We've got Giratina and Tapu Lele, the deck that won last week's Ursa Days tournament, and still was certainly a decently high performing deck this week. If we took a look at the standings, I believe there was a Tapu Lele that placed pretty high. It got 5th place, which is pretty decent. I think overall its performance this week definitely suffered a little bit in the face of all of the Meowscarada decks, but I certainly I rather still think it's a really, really good deck. And to me, it's taken the place of Snorlax for sure. Some people are still playing Snorlax, and that's totally fine, but I think it's better than Snorlax in really every way. If you didn't want to play the Oricorio for those specific matchups, you can play Tapu Lele. It's good against Oricorio, but also good against Giratina and Darkrai. But you're probably going to struggle quite a bit against the Grass decks for sure. And I think that the fighting decks and even Magnezone Oricorio is probably going to do pretty decent against you. So that's really where this deck kind of fills into a really weird spot. We are going to keep it A tier because I think it's certainly still one of the top decks of the format, but it's not something that I would really consider putting in the S tier right now. Again, it really comes down to like the fact that Grass is seeing so much play and how well Grass is kind of positioned against a lot of the other decks in the format. And if we're kind of assuming what decks are going to see so much play in this next week or so, or next weekend's tournament, I really think that Grass will be perhaps one of the most played decks, which really does put a massive change around the metagame and which decks are kind of more viable than not. And it really kind of knocks a lot of those S tier decks out of the S tier because Meowscarada is so well positioned against a lot of those decks that we had really considered to be S tier decks in the previous week. So yeah, massive meta shifts is what the theme of this week is. And we talked about it yesterday, and the tier list I think definitely reflects that for sure. So yeah, Tapu Lele, it's definitely A tier. It's a really, really strong deck, but certainly not something that's as commanding of an S tier slot as it was maybe in previous weeks. Really all because of Meowscarada and Decidueye and really what these Grass decks are doing to the format for sure. Okay, what do we got next? We've got Lunala. All right, Lunala and Giratina is it's tough. It's definitely tough out here. I know some people really like this deck. I think Psychic in general is in kind of an awkward spot for sure. This is a deck that just in general doesn't want to see grass. You're playing a ton of different Pokemon. It's a little bit inconsistent in how it flows. Yes, we are playing Giratina, and Lunala itself has a strong effect, but its attack is kind of just not strong enough, again, for the same kind of downsides that Gengar does, only 100 damage. Too many scenarios where we're not even able to take 3 or 2 KOs, and that does feel bad. We're not great against Oricorio. Yes, we can play like Necrozma, or we can play the Giratina that's not an EX and certainly get around Oricorio, but then we still have to deal with Magnezone. So in a scenario where we are going against Magnezone Oricorio, Magnezone can just kind of come in and KO those few Pokemon, and then one lone Oricorio just auto wins the matchup, right? So it really isn't that great. If we take a look here, it had 8 people play it. Very small amount of people play this particular archetype, and it had a 25% win rate, 8 and 24. This is a deck that really hasn't done anything at all this format, but for whatever the reason, Lunala is sort of one of the, I guess like the pack art Pokemon, right? It's one of the, like the mascots for this expansion. So you would think that it would be a little bit better or a little bit more viable, but it truthfully just really isn't that good. Lunala has to also go into the, sorry, I shifted around the tab there on accident. It has to also go D tier. Unfortunately, I know some people really like this archetype as well, but I mean, come on. It's done nothing but lose most of its games for the last couple of weeks. I don't know if we put a D tier or C tier last week, but this week I certainly, looking at the data and how it performed this weekend in the largest tournament of all time, we have to put it in the D tier. It's unfortunate for sure. Psychic is kind of in a tough spot. I just think a lot of the Psychic Pokemon are a little bit undertuned, and they kind of get carried by Giratina, but you can't just throw Giratina in every deck and expect it to be a top tier deck. Now, certainly some decks do that. Giratina does make certain decks definitely top tier, but not this one. Not this one really at all. So it's got to go into the D tier. Next up, what do we have? We have Arceus and Crobat. Arceus and Crobat is probably one of the most interesting decks in Pokemon Pocket right now. The thing about Arceus and Crobat is that with Carnivine, whether you're playing it with Carnivine or you're playing it with Darkrai, or Giratina, there's a lot of ways that people are playing this particular combination. The thing with this combo is that no matter how we play it, it's always going to win like probably 51 to 53% of its games. It has every single week since it saw play. It's still a tremendous choice in ranked battles. It's just super strong if you draw the right Pokemon, if you draw all of the cards in the correct order. However, if you don't draw the cards in the correct order, it's kind of a sitting duck. So you're really just kind of playing a deck that's kind of an autopilot deck that's like, hey, let's see if we draw our cards. Did we draw them? Cool, we probably win. If not, we probably lose. It really kind of feels like a deck list like that, but that's not a reason for us to rank it any higher or lower. This has been an A tier deck for the last like 2 or 3 weeks, and I think it's certainly one of the strongest decks of the format. I even considered putting it in S tier this week, purely based off the fact that it just does not care. It does not care what decks are in the metagame. It doesn't care what the matchups are. It's basically like a solitaire deck, meaning it doesn't matter. There's no interaction with your opponent. It's just like, hey, do I get my cards out? If I do, good luck, man, but if I don't, yeah, whatever, I might just concede. It really kind of feels like a deck, like it feels like that. So we're going to put it in the A tier, I think, still. Partly just because I don't necessarily feel like I love this archetype as much as I love maybe some other archetypes. Is Magnezone going to be the only S tier deck in the tier list this week? That would be kind of crazy. But I just can't. I mean, Arceus Crobat is still really good. Again, 52.5% win rate. It is the 4th most played deck of the format. At least it was of this tournament. And yeah, it's always going to do good. I would be surprised to see it win a tournament, but I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, to see it kind of always at the top of like top 4, even like in the finals, things like that. Yeah, it's got to go A tier to me. To me, it's like kind of the quintessential A tier deck. I think it's really, really strong. I think it's really, really decent. But yeah, I can't really see it, that much different than it was in previous weeks. Honestly, it really hasn't changed much. Next up, we've got the Charizard decks. Let's knock these out. Let's talk about Charizard and Turtonator first, which interestingly enough actually saw more play this week than Charizard and Incineroar did. Now, the interesting thing about tournament play with Turtonator and Charizard is that it never has that high of a win rate, for whatever the reason. This week, it was, I think, what is this, the 6th or 7th most played deck. Again, 2.5% or about 3% of the meta share saw more play than Charizard and Incineroar for the first time ever, which is certainly a big thing to keep in mind, but it had a 46% win rate. And if you go back in the previous weeks, it's always had about a 46% win rate. Now, when I play this deck list in Master Ball in ranked battles, I do phenomenally well. For whatever the reason, it just feels like you know, whenever I play this deck in ranked battles, the game gives me good matchups. Certainly, we're really good against the Meowscarada decks and against the grass decks. So that's certainly an upside, but Turtonator theoretically should give us the advantage against the Oricorio decks as well. Now, unfortunately, I just think that the deck is a little bit inconsistent. It is a combination that relies on you drawing Kiawe and also leading with Turtonator. And the thing with Turtonator is that it sort of doesn't, you can't retreat with it. It's got a retreat cost of 4, which means you know, you certainly would rather lead with Turtonator than like a Charmander because there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to find Rare Candy or a Charizard. But if we don't draw Kiawe, then we basically just have like a dead Pokemon in the active spot. And unless you have a second Turtonator that you can start manually attaching to, it really isn't worth, like, it's not doing anything, you know? So Turtonator is certainly a little bit awkward. It's a deck that I love playing in ranked battles and that I think does really well in ranked battles, but in tournament, for whatever the reason, just never really does that well. And even in a tournament right now, with Meowscarada being the third most played deck, none of the fire decks had that high of a win rate, which is kind of interesting if you kind of think about it like that. There was one Charizard Turtonator deck that made a top cut, but it didn't do that well. It's a strange deck. It really is. I got to put it in the B tier. I do, for the reason being that for whatever the reason in tournaments, it just never performs that well. And I don't necessarily know why. Maybe some people aren't playing it correctly. I just don't know. But you know, when you take a look at the data from this past weekend, 80 people played this particular deck, 46% win rate, and only one of them made top 128, made top cut. So that kind of tells me everything I need to know, and I do think it's probably a B tier deck. Now, Charizard and Incineroar is a little bit different. Even though it saw less play this weekend, it actually saw, I believe, more representation in top cut. It had 2 players instead of 1 like Charizard Tornado did. And it had a 60% win rate in top cut. Had a little bit of a higher win rate in Swiss rounds in day 1, that being about 48%. You would think that, again, Charizard would be a much better choice given, you know, how much like Giratina Darkrai and Meowscarada saw play in this tournament. But I think for whatever the reason, I think that Oricorio sees enough play that, you know, no matter kind of what fire deck you're running, you probably don't love hitting Oricorio. And that kind of feels a little bit bad. So Fire's in a really odd spot. But when we take a look at the format moving forward, we have to kind of think about it like this. Like grass decks are going to see a lot more play, and then Magnezone Oricorio will see a lot more play. It's in a kind of a similar spot to Garchomp, where we should be good against grass, but weak to the Oricorio Magnezone deck. It's actually kind of like the opposite of Garchomp, where Garchomp is good against Magnezone Oricorio, but is bad against grass. Charizard's kind of the opposite. It's in a kind of the opposite spot as Garchomp. I just don't really think it's as good as Garchomp inherently, and I think Rampardos is kind of a better Pokemon than people give it credit for. So, you know what? Charizard and Incineroar is still really good, but is it an A tier choice? That's what I'm kind of debating on right now. It would feel bad to not put any fire decks in the A tier for sure, considering that how much grass is going to see play. But you know, none of them have ever really performed that well. You know, that's just kind of what it comes down to. I guess the Charizard and Incineroar player, one of them did get 9th place, and that was Sparza. So shout out to Sparza. You know what? Yeah, we'll pull the trigger here. I think it's better than Turtonator Charizard in general. So we're gonna go ahead and put it in the A tier. It's certainly low A tier. It's like bottomish A tier. But yeah, I can't say too much about it because for whatever the reason, its average win rates are just certainly not that high, and that probably is because of Oricorio, and Turtonator has its inconsistencies. So yeah, that's where we're feeling right now as far as the fire deck scale. Let's wrap this up here. This is an hour long, way longer than I anticipated this video being. You know what? It just goes that way. I don't know. We dragged on a little bit in today's video. We went a little bit more slow than we otherwise would have, but it's all good. Let's wrap this up finally with Giratina and Snorlax. There is Oricorio Giratina here, but this is actually the same deck as Greninja and Oricorio, so they're on the tier list twice. That's why we're not going to rank this one. Well, I guess we'll just put it right next to it because they're the same deck, basically. But next up, we've got Snorlax and Giratina. Like I said, I think Tapu Lele really took the position of Snorlax, and I guess you could kind of look at the metagame right now and be like, well, Snorlax should be like fairly decent against Meowscarada. It should be fairly decent against Oricorio. Magnezone, of course, does kind of slide in there, and that's something that you have to deal with, but Snorlax in general has its inconsistencies. Not only is it a Pokemon that you can't retreat, but you'll have to lead with it or else it's really not very useful, and we also need Berry. Right, so it's similar to Turtonator. It's very similar to Turtonator, in fact. I think it's just a colorless Pokemon, so it kind of splashes a little bit better. Turtonator in general feels a little bit better than Snorlax in most case scenarios, but you can play Pokemon Center Lady, and you can do a lot of different shenanigans as well to keep Snorlax awake. And yeah, I think in previous weeks, I think I put this. Like, it definitely saw a dip last week when Tapu Lele won, and I think it's kind of continued to see a dip, but I don't think it's necessarily something that from a positioning standpoint is much worse than it was in previous weeks. In fact, I think with Magnezone Oricorio and Decidueye seeing so much more play and Rise, I actually kind of feel like it deserves to go into the B tier still. I think it's still kind of a B tier choice. So we're going to go ahead, slap into the B tier. Again, the tiers aren't actually in order, so keep that in mind. They're like somewhat in order, but not really. So keep that in mind. Yeah, there it is, guys. There's the tier list this week. An hour long this week. It was an hour-long tier list, and that's crazy. But for whatever the reason, we just talked a little bit slower today. We went through things a bit slower. It's okay. You know, there's a lot to talk about. Largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time. And this is where my tier list falls. Now, I don't actually feel like that great about a lot of the tier lists, to be honest with you. Like, in terms of like where I put the decks. Like, I did put Magnezone S tier. And, you know, the more I think about it, the more I feel like it probably is going to be an S tier deck. Like, yes, it did get first place, but you got to think like it's going to see more play. You know, Giratina will still see a lot of play, but Meowscarada will also still see a lot of play because of how well it did. And I think that Magnezone will still be in a pretty like good position considering what the metagame will likely look like going into this next week. But, you know, all of that is kind of conjecture, to be fair. This is all a little bit of an assumption. It did get first place, so at least we have that in terms of justifying it going into the S tier. You could potentially put Meowscarada in the S tier as well. I don't necessarily feel as confident about that. I want to be a little bit more particular and a little stingy as to what decks we put up there into the S tier. So Magnezone is going to find its way up there, even though, again, I mean, you think about it. I mean, only 2 of them made top cut. 1 of them got first place. 1 of them got 4th place. And that is certainly really impressive when you consider 128 decks were in top cut this past weekend. So Magnezone Oricorio, S tier this week. It did win the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament of all time. So shout out to Magnezone and Oricorio, a deck that I've been somewhat disrespectful towards. But again, if everyone's going to be playing Grass, and if Grass is going to be one of the most popular decks of the format, it kind of slots in really, really well. It really has just gotten a massive boost based off of that. And I think when a deck kind of rises in play like that, like when a Decidueye Meowscarada deck sees so much play when it otherwise didn't, it's going to change around the flow of the format a lot. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So yeah, shout out to the Grass decks. Shout out to Meowscarada Decidueye. Shout out to you guys for sitting through this very long video, which I apologize. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, I will say that, you know, by the time, you know, next Tuesday rolls around, you know, the mini set might be coming out. It might already be out. It might be coming out in like a couple of days. So you gotta keep that in mind. Things are going to change so quickly. And I do think that this next mini set will likely change the format around a lot. And I think that because this format isn't nearly close to being figured out yet, and things are evolving so quickly, changing so quickly, that throwing in like a complete additional set and all of the new cards into this metagame already, it's just going to shake things up so crazily that nobody's really going to know what's going on. And it kind of is just going to be a free-for-all, which I'm really excited about. And you guys are going to want to stay tuned for all of that coverage. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for all of that coming in the next week or two. Really excited. Anyway, guys, let's wrap it up. Peace out. Have a good one. Like the video, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll see you guys later. Have a good one. And yeah. Bye.